For decades, the creative team of WWE had their, shall I say, unique ways of approaching women's wrestling. From completely abandoning the Women's Championship twice in the 90s, which resulted in the title being inactive for the majority of the decade, to the women's legacy during the Ruthless aggression era, being mostly anything you can think of but them actually wrestling, to the infamous Divas era. At some point, it seemed like the fates of female newcomers were sealed even before they stepped foot in the company. But in just a few years, four women changed how WWE viewed women's wrestling forever. From their days in NXT to revolutionizing the landscape of the main roster, and ultimately seeing years of hard work culminate at WrestleMania 35, today we relive the immense legacy of the group known as the Four Horsewomen. To better understand the impact the group of Charlotte, Becky Lynch, Sasha Banks, and Bayley had on women's wrestling in WWE, it is crucial to first rewind back a bit. In the years leading to their arrival, let's look at some statistics that will be very useful for comparison later on. In 2010, the longest Divas Championship match was just a bit over 6 minutes. In 2011, it was 8.5 minutes when Beth Phoenix took the title away from Kelly Kelly, and it was the only Divas Championship match longer than 8 minutes that year. In 2012, the number was right around 7 minutes. More often than not, the matches lasted about a couple of minutes. While it goes without saying, it's important to understand how much the women of the early 2000s were limited. Despite all their potential, superstars like Melina, Beth Phoenix, and Natalya stood very little chance of showcasing what they were truly capable of. As for the Ruthless aggression era, some of the biggest female stars of that period were following one specific trend that was harmful to their reputation. During multiple different time frames, Trish Stratus and Lita were heavily involved in some sort of a romantic storyline. To be clear, both women also helped elevate women's wrestling with memorable matches and rivalries. The problem wasn't them, it was the creative direction surrounding the division. Now, each of us can feel differently about this kind of, if you even call it that, storytelling, but it did practically no good for them as superstars, or for the division as a whole. Whether it was Trish Stratus's infamous storyline of being a side piece to Vince McMahon, or being caught between Christian and Chris Jericho, or Lita's multiple angles with the Hardys, Kane, and Edge, the common denominator was that the women often became supporting characters in stories centered around the men. While those storylines certainly gave them television time, they rarely gave them meaningful opportunities to be presented as elite competitors. Their value too often came from who they were associated with, rather than what they could accomplish inside the ring. Fast forward to today, and that philosophy has almost completely disappeared. And make sure to correct me in the comments if I'm missing someone, but in the modern era, besides Dominic Mysterio's storylines, it's difficult to think of any top women's star whose character revolves around a soap opera-style romance. Besides the Four Horsewomen, there are many other examples where, instead of focusing on their looks, athleticism, and individualism are now the main traits the creative is looking to push. Bianca Belair, Tiffany Stratton, Jade Cargill, Sol Ruca, Lyra Valkyria, and many others symbolize something completely opposite to what the divas of the 2000s and early 2010s represented. Instead of being a part of somebody else's story, they create their own. They don't exist to support the men's division. The men's division and the women's division simply coexist as equals. Turns out, if you just give them the opportunity, female superstars can do just as well as their counterparts. But none of this happened overnight. They say lightning doesn't strike twice, but after Becky Lynch made her NXT debut in 2014, for the second time, WWE's developmental platform now possessed a group of four highly gifted individuals whose careers would be extremely intertwined for a very long time to come. And just like the famous OVW4, each of these women was bringing something different to the table. Bayley was the ultimate babyface. Sasha's boss character was your classic, overconfident, and respect-lacking wrestling heel. Charlotte was elevating the in-ring action by taking advantage of her superior athletic skills, while Becky Lynch was an underdog in search of her personality. Even before Becky debuted, the pairing of Charlotte and Banks was already writing its history, with one being the daughter of the dirtiest player in the game, and the other being the pragmatic type of individual who would do anything it takes to get the win. The two quickly found each other when Charlotte united herself with Banks in a team known as the BFFs. They definitely didn't stay best friends forever, and it didn't matter anyway, since the BFFs stood for the beautiful, fierce females. While debuting during the same period and forming a tag team, two inflated egos can coexist for only so long. And with Paige relinquishing the title during the spring of 2014, there could only be one champion. In a shocking to absolutely nobody watching this video manner, out of the trio of Charlotte, Sasha Banks, and Bayley, Flair was the one to taste the gold first. Now, besides making history for herself at the first ever NXT takeover, where she beat Natalya in the tournament finals, only in hindsight can it be seen that it was the beginning of something so much bigger. Starting May 29, 2014, the NXT Women's Championship would be in the possession of the Four Horsewomen, excluding Becky, for the next 2 years. With the very first cornerstones of the NXT Women's division in Paige and Emma moving to the main roster, the Four Horsewomen wasted no time making NXT's division their own. As for the match itself, without any exaggeration, it is hard to ignore the historic value it has. The card that night also featured Tyler Breeze versus Sami Zayn, and the main event championship match between Neville and Tyson Kidd. Yet, in a 15-plus minute match, Charlotte and Natalya stole the show. You can have whatever opinion on Charlotte you'd like, but you can't downplay her role in revolutionizing what the women of WWE were capable of a good year before the Women's Revolution was even a term. Back there in developmental in 2014, Charlotte was building, brick by brick, a whole new world of possibilities for female wrestlers, where women's matches could actually be centered around, well, wrestling. Now, soon after she won the title, Charlotte dumped Banks, effectively ending their partnership, which was just in time to create the first chapter in a series of rivalries between the four. Charlotte defending the title in a program against Bayley during the fall of 2014 was the first major storyline. While not necessarily making the headlines just yet, the groundwork for the epic 2015 was laid down here. While the trio of Flair, Banks, and Bayley were already the key players of the brand, Becky Lynch wasn't able to find her own spot just yet. Instead, she managed to get her tiny bit of the spotlight when she turned on Bayley and joined Sasha Banks to form Team Bay, which, of course, meant best at everything. Month after month, the characters of these four were transforming in front of our own eyes. But of course, before Lynch turned on Bayley, there was Charlotte walking out on Banks. The time to pay the piper was there, or so thought the boss, and the next piece of the puzzle was Sasha challenging Charlotte for the title at the end of 2014. The matches between these two, without a doubt, had more chemistry than the meetings between Flair and Bayley. While not showcasing the best wrestling one could have imagined just yet, the level of their performance was still heads above whatever the main roster had to offer. At one of the biggest shows of the year, Survivor Series, the championship match between AJ Lee and Nikki Bella lasted a miserable 34 seconds. Meanwhile, on the Black and Gold brand, the typical length was between 10 and 12 minutes, which is already quite the improvement from the typical range of 4 to 6 minutes during the Divas era. Anyways, by the end of 2014, Charlotte had a series of wins over all the other three. Fun fact, throughout 2014, Flair faced each of the other Four Horsewomen 3 times, and she won every single time. With Becky being the obvious underdog here, and Sasha and Bayley disputing for the number 2 spot, Charlotte was in a league of her own. The need for a serious challenge, combined with all the stabbings they did to each other, led to the fatal 4-way championship match featuring all 4 at NXT TakeOver Rival. In matching fashion to their personalities, these 4 ladies were approaching the match with 4 different mindsets. Charlotte, being high on her 200-plus day dominant champion run, was rightfully referring to herself as the greatest athlete in the game and someone who couldn't be defeated. Sasha didn't hide the fact that she was capable of doing about anything to win the big one. Bayley was rightfully acknowledging the fact that in this match, everyone was by herself, which meant she couldn't trust anyone, including Charlotte, with whom they had to unite for a bit to oppose the duo of Banks and Lynch. Becky, undoubtedly, had the most to prove, and leading up to this match, she borrowed the demeanor of her then best friend Sasha Banks, meaning she was ready to give her all, including throwing their friendship into the mix of things if needed. Now, while women's wrestling in NXT was already on a solid level in 2014, especially considering the strong match Flair and Natalya had at the first ever takeover, this fatal 4-way only leveled things up for years to come. On a show that also included such matches as Finn Balor versus Neville and a 20-plus minute championship fight between Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn, the Four Horsewomen proved they could stand toe-to-toe with NXT's biggest male stars and deliver one of the night's most memorable matches. And on that historic night, it was time for this group to write a new chapter in their story. After stealing Bayley's momentum and pinning the champ, Sasha Banks ended the 258-day reign of Charlotte Flair. The new star was born that night, and admittedly, in 2015, the Women's Championship needed someone like the boss. Don't get it twisted. Charlotte's reign did its job of being a starting point to the real women's revolution that was happening in the early days of Black and Gold NXT. As clearly being one of, if not the best female athletes on the roster at the time, having the natural presence of a champion and the legacy behind her name, she deserves a lot of credit for all the success the NXT Women's Championship had in the 2000s. With that being said, Sasha Banks had something of her own to offer. Her possessing the championship wasn't just about great matches. It was about making the title feel like the center centerpiece of NXT and making fans feel emotionally invested in the person holding it. After losing the title, there was ultimately nothing more left for Charlotte to do on a black and gold brand. Aside from occasional title shots on episodes of NXT, both she and Bayley would spend the next few months in NXT being involved in storylines of little significance. With these two taking a step back, the next takeover would be all about best friends turning bitter rivals. While there was no dramatic betrayal involved here, since the two rather went their separate ways soon after Banks won the title, the story was still there given their history. While being a part of the same generation, the Boss was already a believable champion heel, which she was frequently using to taunt Becky with by telling Lynch that she simply didn't have what it takes to be on the same level as her. That was a common theme for Becky throughout her entire venture in the black and gold brand. During their program, Becky openly admitted that she united herself with Banks in hopes of leveling up her game because she saw the Boss as superior to herself. While not being quite as groundbreaking as what Sasha and Bayley would do later in the summer, this one has its own historic importance. First and foremost, out of the four of them, Becky was clearly the last established one. While she was unsuccessful in capturing the gold, TakeOver Unstoppable was the breaking point in her journey, where, arguably, for the first time ever, she truly felt like a future main event player. This one program with the Boss put her on the map and is one of the biggest reasons why she would be trusted with making history just 2 months later in July. Second of all, their match continued the hot streak of matching the bar set by the top male performers. In fact, here they actually raised the bar even higher by having both the longest and the best match of the show, which is, again, something their colleagues from the main roster still couldn't have even dreamed of. All in all, even before the historic Banks versus Bayley rivalry, the women's wrestling of NXT had already revolutionized the way female superstars were treated. Instead of strictly relying on characters, the match between Sasha and Becky served as a good example that their level of performance was so good that after the end of the match, there were seemingly no losers. Despite technically losing, Becky Lynch moved one step further in her journey of making herself relevant. In only a year, from Charlotte beating Natalya in the tournament finals to start her lengthy reign of athletic superiority, which included singles programs against all the other three horsewomen, to their fatal four-way match, to Sasha Banks starting to write her own history, along with elevating Becky in the process, and with all the backstabbing in between, everything was finally in place for the revolution that would define not only the Four Horsewomen, but an entire generation of women's wrestling. On the July 13th, 2015 episode of Monday Night Raw, Divas champion Nikki Bella, being on the 232nd day of her reign, the one that started with that embarrassing 34-second match at Survivor Series, was claiming that she, along with her sister Brie and Alicia Fox, who were known as Team Bella, were ruling the division and that nobody on the roster was a worthy enough challenger. Stephanie McMahon cut it short, and she clearly didn't like Nikki's claim of running the women's division. Plain and simple, Stephanie was there to remind her that she was the one who called the shots. She did agree with the champ on the noticeable lack of competition, and after referring to all the success women had in other sports, she called for a women's revolution in WWE. Being self-aware enough, Stephanie admitted she couldn't do it on her own, but she just happened to have a group of names on her mind who could help make it happen. First, she called out Paige to the ring. The first ever NXT Women's Champion didn't stand much of a chance against the trio of Team Bella, and that's where things changed forever. McMahon continued her speech by talking about somebody relentless and persevering enough who could even out the odds and join Paige. After building up the women's division of NXT, Becky Lynch and Charlotte arrived to unite with Paige and form the team known as PCB. Naomi and Tamina intervened, talking about how they were all the competition Stephanie was looking for. That night, Stephanie was all for that type of behavior. She was liking what she was seeing, which was two performers in Naomi and Tamina who were looking to take their amount of the spotlight. Speaking of somebody obsessed with the spotlight, there was one more person backstage who Stephanie believed matched the energy of Naomi and Tamina and would be one of the greatest additions to the division that was on the mission of a lifetime. Last but not least, the NXT Women's Champion Sasha Banks was introduced, who, along with Naomi and Tamina, formed the group called Bad. With Charlotte, Becky, and Sasha all storming into the main roster on the same night, it's hard to exaggerate the importance of this segment, given how much these three would change the Divas landscape right from the get-go. However, you couldn't help but feel like something, or should we say, somebody, was left behind. Despite having a similar impact on making this revolution a reality, Bayley didn't make it to Raw that night. But unlike the others, her story in NXT wasn't finished. She had spent the better part of 2 years falling just short of the championship, and rushing her to the main roster would have meant abandoning the journey fans had become so invested in. Instead, NXT gave Bayley something WWE rarely does, and they did it long before it became a meme: time to finish the story. Flair and Banks had both reached the top of the division, while Lynch was coming off hot after her main event program against Sasha. Bayley needed the breakthrough program of her own, which leads us to the famous Sasha Banks versus Bayley championship feud. Expectedly so, the main idea behind this storyline was that Bayley was the only one out of the four to not make it to the main roster just yet. Sasha being Sasha, she took every opportunity to shove it down Bayley's face. According to her, Bayley was just not main event material. With that being said, the hugger had a world to prove, and after making her return, she demanded the very best to demonstrate that she was, in fact, ready for the big time. In 2 singles matches, she defeated both Charlotte and Becky, who were wrapping up their journeys in NXT, meaning the path was clear for that championship match she so desperately needed. From Stephanie's pre-match speech, to all the spectacular action in between the ring bells, to the incredible Barclays Center crowd, and to the post-match celebration, which involved all the Four Horsewomen, this was a special match taking place during a special period in WWE's women's history. This match, which wasn't only the best on the card, but a contender for the match of the year, serves as a turning point in how WWE's women's wrestling was perceived. It proved that a women's match could carry the same emotional weight, tell just as compelling of a story, and leave the audience just as invested as any men's main event. From that point forward, greatness was no longer measured with an asterisk because it was women's wrestling. It was simply great wrestling. Finally, after seeing all the success their Brooklyn match had, the creative pulled the trigger and let their rematch main event the next takeover, which had a very fitting name, Respect. That night, the men's longest match topped out at 10 minutes. Bayley and Sasha, on the other hand, had a whopping 30 minutes at their disposal, given that it was a 30-minute Iron Woman match. From the longest championship match at the beginning of the decade being less than 10 minutes, these two were trusted with half an hour. This was also the first time ever that women headlined a major WWE event. As for the action itself, it had it all. The pacing, the psychology, stamina, and storytelling. Another great performance in the book, tears, flowers, and the whole NXT roster, along with the fans in attendance, clapping in unison. Bayley had been established as the ultimate babyface champion, while Sasha would go on to create history on the main roster as well. By WrestleMania 32, Flair, Lynch, and Banks were already at the forefront of the main roster. Mirroring her NXT success, Charlotte was the first one to claim gold, and she did so only 2 months after her debut. With Nikki Bella no longer having a chokehold on the division, and teams PCB and Bad, which were doing no good to the trio of Flair, Banks, and Lynch, slowly falling apart, the new era was truly upon us. Coming into 2016, Charlotte was already positioned as a legitimate champion who was also now a heel. Sasha and Becky were obviously already feeling left behind, given how naturally Flair was headlining the women's roster, which made them consistently pursue her championship coming into WrestleMania season. With the triple threat match made official for the show, the creative knew they had to seize the opportunity now and bring as much attention to this match as possible, because if there was one thing certain, it was that this trio was going to put on one hell of a match. With all the negative reputation the Divas Championship had built throughout the years, and the new wave of talent now representing something new, the time for a much-needed update was here. With WrestleMania 32 being the most attended show in company history, it was the perfect opportunity to leave behind the Divas title and instead introduce the WWE Women's Championship. With one of the biggest stages possible, there was no room for error. From revolutionizing the industry in front of 400 people in the hall of Full Sail University, to now cementing their legacies in front of 80,000 people at the enormous AT&T Stadium. The clear story of Flair being the dominant champion, Banks being just one step behind her, and Lynch still trying to win her first championship, memorable sequences, quick pacing, near falls, and all in all, high-quality wrestling is something that by that time the fans were expecting from them, and they delivered once again. At the biggest stage of them all, on par with the multi-man Intercontinental Championship ladder match, these three once again stole the show. More importantly, they validated WWE's decision to retire the Divas Championship once and for all. The new Women's Championship wasn't simply a cosmetic redesign, it symbolized an entirely new philosophy. No longer were women competing for a title associated with the Divas era, they were now fighting for a championship that carried the same identity and prestige as every other title in WWE. After everything the Four Horsewomen had accomplished over the previous 2 years, there wasn't a more fitting moment to officially close one chapter and begin another. In a similar way to the Banks vs. Lynch and Banks vs. Bayley NXT feuds, this WrestleMania 32 triple threat really had no losers. Despite not winning the match, both Becky and Sasha left AT&T Stadium better off than they entered it. With the draft making its return in the summer of 2016, Becky Lynch found herself on the blue brand, where for the next 2 years she would be the workhorse who was still in search of her personality. Bayley finally made it to the main roster after her 200-plus-day NXT title reign came to an end, and Charlotte and Sasha would continue being the key players in the women's division, with them elevating the women's game of Monday Night Raw even further. Throughout their extensive half-a-year rivalry, the 2016 story of Flair versus Banks produced two remarkable things. First, the origins of the memes about Sasha Banks not being able to hold the title for more than a couple of weeks, with her winning it twice and then shortly after dropping it back to Flair. Secondly, and way more importantly, is the historic first-ever women's pay-per-view main event, which was also the first-ever women's Hell in a Cell match. Hell in a Cell had always been reserved for some of WWE's biggest rivalries, so putting two women in there and giving them the final spot on the card was another clear indication of just how far the division had come. The match itself might not have reached the heights of their NXT classics, but at this point, the significance went far beyond match quality. Just a few years earlier, the idea of two women closing a WWE pay-per-view, let alone doing it inside Hell in a Cell, would have sounded completely unrealistic. After WWE had failed multiple generations of female talent, and with all due respect to Bayley and Lynch, throughout 2014, 2015, and 2016, the duo of Flair and Banks was the driving force behind turning the idea of women's main events from a fantasy into a reality. The core idea behind their rivalry was simple, yet very effective, given how well it worked with some of the biggest men's feuds of all time. Similarly to great stories like Austin versus Rock and Cena versus Punk, here we had the unquestionable favorite in Charlotte Flair, who seemed to be on a level of her own, and the close second in Sasha Banks, who didn't take no for an answer and wanted to prove she could beat Charlotte Flair. Oh, there is one more remarkable thing about this feud, which is its culmination. Their 34-minute Iron Man match at Roadblock was the longest ever WWE women's singles match to date. I couldn't fact-check it for sure, but it might still hold that title in 2026, and if not, please let me know down in the comments. And while the wrong person may have walked out victorious that night, the match itself broke yet another major barrier, proving just how much WWE was now willing to trust its female talent with. By this point, the snowball was rolling at full speed. The groundwork had been laid, and WWE's women were no longer simply being given longer matches. They were steadily conquering the same types of matches and opportunities that had historically been reserved for the men. In 2017, the women got their own Money in the Bank ladder match, and while its controversial finish left plenty to be desired, to the point that they had to go with a rematch on SmackDown, the very existence of the match was another barrier broken. But the next year, the women conquered an even bigger one. At the 2018 Royal Rumble, WWE introduced the first ever Women's Royal Rumble match, giving the division one of the company's most iconic annual traditions. For decades, the Royal Rumble had been one of WWE's biggest spectacles, and now the women were getting their own version of it, with Charlotte, Sasha, and Bayley revolutionizing both the NXT and main roster divisions. The question of whether WWE's women deserve to be treated like the men had already been answered on multiple different occasions. There are, of course, 4 horsewomen, not 3. With Flair, Banks, and Bayley getting the most of the spotlight throughout the years, by 2018 it started to seem like the Irish lass kicker would stay the weak link of this group forever. With little progression to her character's credibility over the years, the need for a change was there. To continue the Four Horsewomen's NXT legacy of best friends becoming bitter rivals, at SummerSlam 2018, Becky turned on Charlotte, and things were never the same since. Again, the story here practically wrote itself. After her 2016 reign as SmackDown Women's Champion, for the next year and a half, Becky just couldn't seem to gain the needed momentum to capture the lightning again, while right in front of her, Charlotte had gained her 8th championship by defeating both Lynch and the champion Carmella. Lynch, however, wasn't the only one who had enough. With most of WWE's fan base feeling sick over all of Charlotte's success, it didn't take long before the creative had to pivot. Ironically, instead of becoming a hated heel, Becky's bumpy journey up to that point left the fans with no choice but to instead support her in her rivalry against the tyrannic Flair, who had a firm grip on the division for years now. As a result, the underdog became the man. Here, WWE did a great job of striking while the iron was hot by having Lynch beat Flair at the very next PPV. In the midst of Becky Lynch's rise to the top, another fruit of the labor that the group of Flair, Banks, Bayley, and Lynch started back in NXT was the first ever all-women's WWE pay-per-view. The inaugural Evolution, which took place in October of 2018, was undoubtedly one of the 2 biggest achievements in this thing called the Women's Revolution, which symbolically featured all 4 horsewomen, with Becky and Charlotte stealing the show by bringing that NXT spirit to the mainstream stage and showcasing one of the best WWE women's matches ever in their last woman standing championship fight. A match that further solidified the legitimacy of the man, which continued to grow with each passing month. From the infamous segment of SmackDown invading Raw during the Survivor Series build, where the screenshot of Becky's bloody face became viral overnight, to her winning the Royal Rumble, and to being an underdog once again in the three-way program against SmackDown champion Charlotte and Raw champion Ronda Rousey, her popularity was overshadowing that of every other superstar in the company. By the time of WrestleMania 35 season, she had become the ultimate sign of how much the Four Horsewomen had changed WWE. The ceiling for a female wrestler was no longer simply becoming the best woman on the roster, it was becoming the best, period. Now, by the time of 2019, you'd think the women's revolution had accomplished everything you could have thought about. From being one of the highlights of the highest attended show in company history at WrestleMania 32, to main eventing a PLE, to all sorts of first ever women's gimmick matches, and to having a whole pay-per-view to themselves. Even after repeatedly changing the standards of women's wrestling in WWE for many consecutive years, the fans were still skeptical about the company's intentions of having women main event WrestleMania when, mind you, it was still a one-night show. Being something even more scarce than an all-women's PPV, just a few years earlier, the idea of women main eventing WrestleMania would have seemed almost unthinkable. But if there was one way to make a perfect payoff of everything these women had done in the past 5 years, it was giving them the brightest spotlight the industry has to offer. On April 7, 2019, in front of 70,000 in attendance at MetLife Stadium, the story reached its logical conclusion. One half of the Four Horsewomen in Lynch and Flair, alongside Rousey, who for obvious reasons had to be there, were a part of the single most important match in the history of women's wrestling. From these four giving their all and stealing the show in front of 400 fans at Full Sail University, to Becky and Charlotte representing the women of WWE in the main event of WrestleMania, the journey could hardly have been more fitting. And the only person out of this group who had no success in becoming a champion in NXT was now proudly raising 2 world titles over her head. Looking back, it's easy to reduce the women's revolution to a collection of historic firsts. The first women's Hell in a Cell, the first Money in the Bank match, the first Royal Rumble, the first all-women's pay-per-view, and finally, the first women's WrestleMania main event. But those moments were only possible because the perception of women's wrestling had changed along the way. Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks, Bayley, and Becky Lynch didn't invent women's wrestling, nor were they the only women responsible for its evolution. What they did was become the generation that proved, over and over again, that women could be trusted with the same opportunities, expectations, and spotlight as the men. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy of the Four Horsewomen. They didn't simply leave behind 4 successful careers or a collection of memorable matches. They helped raise the ceiling for everyone who came after them. The women entering WWE today don't have to ask whether they can have their own Money in the Bank match, compete in a Royal Rumble, have an entire show dedicated to them, or close WrestleMania. Those questions have already been answered. And that's why the story of the Four Horsewomen isn't simply about 4 women who became stars. It's about 4 women who helped change what being a star in women's wrestling could mean.